record on this computer. And so we begin always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and in the midst of the challenges and difficulties of our lives, we thank you, Lord, for your many blessings, for the gift of life, for having woken up this morning and being here now for these lectures as we continue to explore what you have for us by way of learning, Lord, learning about the nature that surrounds us and our own human nature as we are part of this earth, the living beings, the living organisms on the earth. And we recognize also your particular and special presence within us as the gift of your spirit within us, the gift of conscience. And may we be able to benefit from these studies, to expand our horizons, and to delve ever more deeply into the truth, which you give us the capacity to understand by way of our reason and our will. We continue to pray, Lord, at this time for all those who are in need of your mercy throughout the world. And we ask this in the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Again, we have a lot of distance between us, so I'm going to remove my mask here. Let's see. All right, any questions or comments from the previous lectures, from the one lecture? That was just the introduction. If I could say kind of the bottom line of that lecture. Let's see, maybe it is saved here. Let me go back to the desktop. Maybe it's in here. Good, there it is. Okay, just pulling up the PowerPoint. The main points here were about the brief history of science in the last 2 centuries and focusing in essentially the second half of the 1800s, where we had these two minds, these two scientific minds, Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel, one working on the theory of evolution, the other one working on genetics, or the how, the transmission at the genetic level, the transmission of characteristics, of inheritance characteristics, which is how Gregor Mendel named these characteristics that were being passed on from one generation to another. Inheritance characteristics or inheritance factors. These inheritance factors, we now know 100 years later by the benefit of molecular genetics that these are the genes. These are physically, mechanically, organically, biologically, on the DNA sequence made up of atoms and molecules. This is what we call the genes. These are the inheritance factors, okay? And so that is essentially provides the mechanism of how we get speciation, how one species may evolve over a long period of time with variation of individuals within the same species, variation of individuals. What I mean by variation is, for example, just the height of people in the human population. We don't all have the same height. So there's variation on height, for example, and that's what we call a phenotype, a characteristic, an express characteristic. And many express characteristics, many phenotypes follow what is known as a normal distribution, a bell-shaped curve, where most of us are the average height for men and women. And then there are a few very tall people and a few very short people. Those are the tails of the bell-shaped curve, right? Of the normal distribution. That's why it's called normalized, because the majority fall somewhere close to the average, to the overall average of the whole population, okay? Or even a sample, a representative sample of the population. Anyway, so variation may lead over a long period of time to speciation, especially if there is climatological change, which is different from weather change, because the weather changes every day and every minute of the day. But the climate is long-term, typically measuring minimally thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, or more comfortably in millions of years. That's long-term climate change may lead to put some pressure on species to have the best fit, survive, and the least fit, to die. And so if they die before reproduction, they don't get to reproduce. They don't get to pass on the weaker genes, all right? So a little anticipation of what we're going to be looking at throughout this course. All right, and then the kind of the second half, I wanted to just give you a background on the classification, the binomial classification of species of this fellow Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, right? Which gives us an 8 category of species classification. The biggest one, doesn't matter where we start, the biggest one is the domain. Domain includes all of the living organisms on Earth. And we have these 3 main domains, these huge domains here. We have the bacteria, we have the archaea, and then we have the eukaryotes. Eukaryote meaning a true nucleus, all the plants, animals, and fungi that have a true nucleus, right? That, in other words, that the DNA is encased, it's enveloped in a membrane, in a nuclear membrane, which, by the way, is also a double membrane, similar to the cell membrane itself, which is a double membrane, the bilayer. So those are the true nuclei organisms, which is basically what we can see with our naked eye. Whereas the bacteria, which are microscopic, don't have a true nucleus, but they do have DNA. They even have a concentration of DNA, but there's no true nucleus. So that means that they diverged, they branched off very early on in evolution, to the point that to this day, they have not developed a nuclear envelope, and therefore they remain as bacteria. Generally, we call them simpler organisms, and they are also unicellular. So each individual is a single cell, right? A bacterium, one bacterium is a single cell. It is microscopic. It fits inside of microscopic cells in our body, for example, with infections. And they have no true nucleus as such, even though they have DNA. Then there's another group of organisms that is even more primitive than the bacteria. They look very, very similar to the bacteria, but they're missing a layer on their cell membrane. They're missing a layer of polypeptides there, or carbohydrates actually. And so because they're missing that layer, it is considered that they diverged even more early than the bacteria. They're more primitive than the bacteria, and they're more archaic. So the word archaic is something primitive, something old, and that's why they're called archaea. All right, so except for that layer, everything else is pretty much very similar to bacteria. But the archaea are also microscopic, single cell, no nuclear membrane, but concentration of DNA in a region, etc. All right, then, so that's at the level of domain. Then when we drill down, mostly in the eukaryotes, okay? When we drill down, then, so 3 domains, then we get into kingdoms, which is about 4 or 5 kingdoms. I've listed them here, depending we're using the old or the new classification. The old simple classification just has 5 kingdoms. The animals that we're familiar with that move around on Earth mostly. Then the plants, which are producers because they photosynthesize, they produce food, and most of the plants don't move around, they're stuck on the ground, okay? Then there's this other kingdom of the fungi, which look like plants, but they don't photosynthesize, so they're not plants. And they're not animals either. They don't move, and they don't have any of the other characteristics, most of the other characteristics that animals have. And so they're classified in this other kingdom of the fungi. Okay. Then we get into the microscopic world. There's a grab bag of protists, which protists is really many different phyla. So it's a pseudo kingdom. The main characteristic that they have in common, these protists, is that they're typically microscopic, and many are single cell, some are colonial. And then there's the algae, which can be single cell, can be colonial. but they can also get large enough so that we can actually see them with our naked eye, so they become macroscopic. The rest of the protists tend to be microscopic, like the amoeba, the paramecium, the euglena, these things that we looked under the microscope in high school. All right, then when we go beyond that and drilling down into each kingdom is subdivided into phyla. There are about 24 different phyla, maybe more, depending. One phylum, several phyla. All right, so phylum gets already into the weeds of the classification, if you will, parsing out more each kingdom into phyla. Then each phylum is divided into classes. At this point, we already have hundreds of different classes when we look at them all together as a group. All right, but they all fit into a particular phylum. From class, then classes are subdivided into orders, then orders into families. Already we're getting at a small scale here, all right? The family, we can talk about the family of hominids, for example. And then, so family, just like in our own family, we got the extended family, right? Which will include maybe 3 or 4 generations. And then we go, that's vertically. When we go horizontally, cousins and second cousins and so forth. So that's kind of the family concept. Then we get into genus and species. So at the level of genus, we're already kind of in the nuclear family in the sense that this is the last name of the individual species. All right, so let's assume that we have siblings. That would be the grouping with our siblings would be at the genus level. So I have one sibling, my brother Claudio, and we're both Cioffi, last name, so that would be our genus, basically. And our individual name, our species name is either Claudio Cioffi or Alfred Cioffi, all right? The species always includes the genus, and that's why it's called binomial, because it has 2 words. The species always includes the genus. It anchors it a little bit more. Also because at some point, some species individual name, like the first name, sometimes it repeats across different phyla. You may run across the same name at some point at the individual level. So anchoring with a genus, then that makes it unique, all right? All right, so that's the classical classification of species in biology and the sciences, genus and species. And then we have popular names, for example, for dog, right? That's a popular name, but that's not a scientific name. It turns out the dog, you know the scientific name for dog, anybody? Okay, so it's from, the genus is Canis, which in Spanish, no perro, but in Latin, can. So Canis is the genus name, and the species is Lupus. So it's actually a wolf. The dog is a very close relative of the wolf. So we have to go into the subspecies to distinguish it from the actual wild wolf, okay, that is out there in nature. So it's Canis lupus familiaris. Canis lupus familiaris, and the familiaris is the subspecies of the wolf. So it's really the dog, the Chihuahua that we see walking around is a subspecies of the wild wolf that can hunt in packs and can kill people and other things because they're top carnivores. It's at the level of the subspecies. All right, there was a chat somewhere in here at some point. Let me see if I can find it. Where's the chatting? Here we go. Canine, yeah, the family. Family is canine, thank you, Canidae, right? All right, so you see we have the classification of species that is binomial, and that allows us to refer to the scientific name of all the living organisms that we have found so far on Earth, which I've mentioned is about 2 million. 2 million species have been classified so far. All right, with first and last name, with genus and species, within their family, order, class, phylum, etc. And I will say that it's estimated that this 2 million species, approximately, represents maybe about 5 to 10% of all the living species that are estimated to live on Earth, all right? So if we bump that 2 million up to 5 to 10%, that means that there may be anywhere between 10 to 20 million species that are living on Earth. So where are the other, 90% of species that we haven't discovered yet? Well, every now and then you get in the news on the BBC or some other news agency that a new monkey was found in the jungles of Brazil or something, but that's rare, okay? It's increasingly rare to find macroscopic species that we can actually see with our naked eyes. The vast majority of the species are actually considered to be microscopic, and that's why we haven't discovered them yet. So two things. First, they're microscopic. Secondly, they're typically down at the bottom of the ocean, 1 to 2 kilometers down or 1 to 2 miles down into the ocean. We just haven't gotten there yet. We've got to some parts of the ocean at the bottom, but certainly not the whole ocean floor, to actual sample, physically bring up stuff from the bottom, the sediment, and see what's in there, okay? So most of these are considered to be species that are deep into the ocean floor and are just waiting to be discovered. Okay, what else did I have here toward the end? Okay, so this gets into today's lecture actually, so I pretty much left it here. If we want to go up in the levels of complexity, well, we'll touch this in the environmental course. So we can go from species to population, and the definition of population scientifically is 2 or more individuals of the same species. Keep in mind, same species in a specific region, okay? We're going to drill more into this when we get the environmental course in the summer. Basically an anticipation that scientifically, biologically, population has a very specific meaning, and it's a double definition. It has 2 parts to it. The first part, essential, that we're talking of individuals of the same species. So when we talk about a pack of wolves, for example, to stay with the issue, the individual wolves inside that population are all wolves, okay? They're all canis lupus. If a dog migrates into that population for a few seconds before it gets eaten up, then that dog doesn't belong to the population, all right? Because it's not the same species. Well, it's a subspecies. So populations is individuals of the same species. But also we have to anchor that population, that group of individuals, in a particular place, because they're not floating out in thin air. They're going to be grounded either on soil, in the water, or on top of a tree somewhere. And so in a specific region or a habitat, what we call habitat, okay? And so that's the definition of population. Like I say, we'll look at plenty of examples when we get into the environmental course. So these are basic concepts that I wanted to express in the first lecture. We're going to move on now, unless there are any questions or comments about that. Hello? Let's see, let's go back there. Well, it depends on what we're looking at. If we're looking at it from the strictly biological sense or from the ecological sense. This is ecological here, all right? Because you see the inclusive sign, all right, greater than. So let me see, did I get this backwards? Oh, I just realized I got all the signs backwards. In other words, yeah. So what do I want to express here? Okay, so basically what I want to express here is that the biosphere is made up of several biomes, and that each biome is made up of several ecosystems. Maybe I got the signs backwards, I don't know. But basically, I want to express that several biomes make up one biosphere. All right, the biosphere is all the living organisms on Earth, and that is divided into about 6 regions, which we call biomes. They're large geographical regions, typically continental regions. Each one of those biomes is subdivided into different ecosystems. So you can think of North America, it can be subdivided into a more cold region, in the Canada region, or more temperate like us here in the United States, or more tropical or subtropical, let's say Mexico and Mesoamerica, all right, for the North American continent. Each ecosystem is going to be made up of communities. Communities will be made up of populations of different species. See, populations of different species. So in a forest, we'll have a population of wolves, we have a population of squirrels, we have a population of birds, of particular birds, etc. Okay, there'll also be a population of moose, etc. And so these are populations, different populations make up a community. And each population is made up of specific species. All right, let me move forward then into today's lecture as such. This is what I hope to cover today. Again, we're still in the big picture of the overview. We're going to talk about worlds, what I mean by worlds. Basically that we live in 3 worlds simultaneously, all right? But we're normally only aware of one of those 3 worlds. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Also, we're going to talk about origins. We'll talk about physical origins of the universe. There are 3 big origins that we need to look at. We need to, of course, here in this course, specifically, we're concerned with the 3rd origin, which is the origin of the human species as a whole, right? Phylogenetically, when did we begin as a human species? But in order to understand that, we just have to put it in the context of the origin of the Earth, which coincides with the origin of our planetary system, what we call the solar system. And then also, the origin of life as a whole, organic life on Earth. So we actually have 4 origins. The origin of our species, before that, the origin of life on Earth as a whole. And before that, the origin of the planet of Earth, which coincides with the planetary system of the solar system. And before that, the origin of the universe as such. So these are the 4 origins: the origin of the universe, the origin of our planetary system, the origin of life, organic life on Earth, and the origin of the human species, okay? And the rest of the semester is basically devoted to that. We're also going to go look at briefly at some fundamental forces, the 4 fundamental forces in nature, in physics, to understand physically, mechanically, these origins, how these origins are possible, all right? The mechanism of how they occur by these 4 fundamental forces. We're going to look at organic molecules, which again, they're grouped into 4 categories. So a lot of 3s and 4s today, okay? 4 groups of organic molecules. We'll get to that in a moment. Then we'll talk about the primitive atmosphere, which has changed over millennia, over millions of years. About 3, maybe 4 times the atmosphere has changed on Earth, from something that was originally extremely toxic to something that is very benevolent for life today, mostly due to the relatively large amount of oxygen, the fact that nitrogen gas is inert, doesn't affect life necessarily, and the fact that CO2 is very, very tiny content. That makes our current atmosphere benevolent, amenable to life, but the primitive atmosphere of the Earth was much different than that, extremely toxic to us today, all right? Then we'll talk about how the origin of species, again, come back to it, the origin of the genus Homo. And then I'm finally going to get into Myers a little bit here. Let's see how far we can get into chapter 1 of Myers. But just in case, I gave you a little summary of it in your handout. And I also emailed that handout last night. So these 3 worlds that I'm talking about, what am I talking about in 3 worlds? All right, so I propose that we're living simultaneously in these 3 worlds, all right? Which we have the microscopic world, the macroscopic world, and I'm calling the super macroscopic world. And it's mostly because of our eyes and the range of vision and the boundaries, the limits of the range of vision. We don't have infinite vision, but we have a pretty wide, broad range of vision, okay? From the very tiny to the very huge that we can see with our naked eye without instruments. And because it's estimated that the vast majority of the information in our brain comes through our eyes, of the 5 senses, the first one, the eyes. The second one is going to be, what do you think is the second sense that's more prevalent? Hearing, exactly. Okay, so even with our eye shot, we can still discern quite a bit from the hearing. But mostly it's estimated anywhere 95% of the information in our brain has come through our eyes. And so that's the macroscopic world, that what I'm calling the normal macroscopic world, is the one that we move in since we open our eyes in the morning until we shut them at night, is what we're seeing consciously or unconsciously. You know, we're just looking around and there's information bombarding our brain all the time. So whatever we can see, we can concentrate on stuff, right? And to look at detail, I can see the little dots on this mask and so forth. I can drill down with sight, but just basically the naked eye. Then we know that there's a whole universe, there's a whole world of microscopic organisms that is existing on the tip of my fingertip here, or even the tip of a pin. There will be thousands, if not millions, of bacteria that are there clinging on to the tip of that pin, you know, for dear life. I cannot see them normally with my eyes, but I can see them with equipment, with instruments. Right? So we have microscopes to see into the microscopic world, and we find that there's a whole universe there. And we can drill down beyond the bacteria. We can go into the molecules that make up these bacteria, and we can go into the atoms that make up those molecules, and we can go into the subatomic particles that are making up those atoms. And then we can look at the subatomic particles of the proton, electron, and neutrons, and we find finally the deepest layer that we've been able to discern and measure so far. They're called the quarks, okay? And at that point, we're into quantum mechanics. And so there are two layers below or deeper into the atom that so far scientists have been able to measure, which is the first one is the subatomic particles of the classical proton, electron, and neutrons, but other also counterpoints like positrons and so forth. But even those particles are not simple, meaning that they're made up of subatomic particles, all right? And that's what they're being called the quarks. And they have funny names. They have top quark and bottom quark and so forth. And they have color and so forth. So these names are very specific to quantum mechanics in physics, right? But there is a standard model. The standard model is very important. The standard model is the atom. So to this day, it's still considered that the atom is a stable unit of matter. Stable unit of matter. Whatever is matter, all right? Whatever is matter, that is material, physical, that can be weight, for example, that has mass, that is going to be made up of atoms at the simplest level, which is stable. Because once we go deeper beyond the atom into the the subatomic particles of the atom, what we find is that they're unstable. In other words, I just cannot have a proton stably sitting there. It's going to attract an electron, it may attract a neutron also, and so forth. So the stable unit of matter is still the atom. And that is called the standard theory, all right, or the standard model of matter, the standard model. All right, that's drilling into the microscopic as deep in as we can go so far with the instruments that we have. Zooming out beyond our normal macroscopic world, the stuff that we can see around, all right? And even looking out into, at this point, we need to have a very big picture because we can essentially see with our naked eye all of the stuff that is on top of the planet Earth as we walk around from country to country, even underwater with scuba diving, whatever. We can see a lot of stuff with our eyes, just with our naked eyes. So we have to look out beyond the world to try to see in the biggest scale of range of our eyes. The moon is fairly close to us. I forget the exact distance, but we can see the craters of the moon, all right? And so we can depict some with our naked eye, looking at a full moon on a particular night, we can discern some level of detail of the moon. That's about it. The sun, of course, we don't want to look at the sun directly, but the sun looks like a little dot, and yet the sun is hundreds of thousands of times larger than the diameter of the Earth. Okay, so what we're seeing as a little dot is actually a huge ball of fire. It's mostly hydrogen and helium that is on fire. It's a ball of gas that is on fire, and because there is space around it, all right, and it generates its own gravitational field, then it's a ball. It's a ball because it's a sphere, all right? Well, that's the same thing. The ball and the sphere is the same thing. But anyway, it's three-dimensional, and so the simplest conformation, the most energetic, conservative conformation of a ball of fire in space is to be a sphere. Is to be a sphere. Anything beyond a sphere is not going to be as stable. It's not going to be as conserved in energy. All right, it's going to take extra energy to do that other, like if it's flattened at the, like a pancake or oblong, etc. Because you have equidistant to the core. And imagine there is so much hydrogen in the sun that it actually exerts a gravitational field to keep all of the planets, the 4 outer planets, the 4 inner planets, and then all of the planets that are in the planetary system in orbit. And that's the kind of gravitational field that the Earth, that the sun is exerting on our solar system, and yet it's gas. So it's telling us that gas weighs. And you know that if you pick up a gas tank, if you have your barbecue thing with gas, right? You run your barbecue with gas. Well, you know when that tank is empty, it's lighter. And when you take it to fill, it's heavier. Why did it become heavier? It's got gas. Yeah, but gas is compressed, and gas has atoms, and atoms weigh because they have mass, and they have mass because they have protons. And the protons are the ones that are massive, that they have a significant mass. Anyway, when we look beyond the solar system, we start seeing, what do we see at night in the sky? We see little white dots, okay? Little white dots that we call stars. But the stars are not really stars, because stars typically is a sun, is a star. And when we look at those little white dots, generally, let's say that we just classify them into 2 categories, the little tiny dots and the bigger dots. The bigger white dots, well, it turns out that the bigger white dots are not suns at all. They're not stars. They're actually planets. They are our outer planets that are reflecting the light of the sun. So very similar to the moon when we have a full moon or half moon, whatever. It is the light of the sun hitting that planet and then reflecting into our eyes, okay? Which takes quite a bit of time to do that. For example, the sun itself, when I look at the sun is no longer there. The sun was there about 8 minutes ago. That's the distance. In the meantime, we have moved from each other, all right? And so that's the distance. It's so long, so astronomical between us and the sun, that the sun is no longer where I see it. It's shifted already. That's the light that I received from 8 minutes ago. Anyway, for the stars or the planets, it's even a longer time, but that's no problem. We still get the reflection at some point into our eyes. So the bigger dots that we see, the bigger stars, are actually planets. So that means that they're not luminous bodies, but they're opaque bodies. So for example, we are an opaque body. We, the Earth, is an opaque body because we don't generate light. We generate heat, but not light, all right, as a planet. The moon is also an opaque body because it doesn't generate, it's not a light bulb. It doesn't generate its own light. The sun is not an opaque body, it's a luminous body. You see? Okay, so the bigger dots at night that we call stars typically are opaque bodies. They are the outer planets or maybe the inner planets, Jupiter, Saturn, what's next to us, Mars and Venus, that are reflecting the light, the sunlight that is hitting them, okay? And we're seeing that. The smaller dots, the little tiny dots, typically they're not just suns, like a single star. Typically they are constellations, which will have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of suns. So they're actual constellations. Okay, so the little tiny dots, typically they are constellation. And a constellation is a humongous disk of suns, like we belong to the Milky Way, right? That's the name of our constellation. And there are millions of suns that make up a single constellation. And there are millions of constellations, all right, in the universe. And we see them as a single little dot. And so my point is that when we go into the super macroscopic, also we need special instruments. And these are not microscopes, these are telescopes. The telescopes are not just optical telescopes with lenses, right? Because at some point, how big a lens can we build? I think the biggest one is like, I think 4 meters or something like that. But then we get into other microscopes that are pick up sound or pick up other waves. And the Hubble one is actually in space. It is orbiting the Earth. All right, by orbiting the Earth, what happens is that these telescopes, they avoid the interference of the atmosphere that has a lot of noise. It filters all the waves, right? And so by putting a telescope in orbit, then we bypass the noise of the atmosphere, the filter of the atmosphere, and it gives us much clearer images. So Hubble was a big one that was put out there. And Hubble, one of the big things that the Hubble telescope measured was that the universe is expanding. All right, so you think of a balloon, take a balloon and put dots around the balloon and then inflate the balloon. You see that the dots are getting away from each other. All of the dots will migrate away from each other as we inflate the balloon. That's basically what is happening to the universe. And that's why when we reverse that clock, if it's expanding now, when we go backwards in time, then if we do 1 over time, right, or 10 to the time to the -1, then the universe would have contracted, all right? And what's the maximum contraction? The maximum contraction is to a single point, not a dot, but a point, which is defined mathematically as 1 dimension. All right, so we're familiar with 3 dimensions. Then 2 dimension is like a sheet of paper, it's 2 dimensions, all right? 1 dimension is the mathematical and the physical definition of a point, a single dimension. And that's how the universe started. And that single dimension point is known as the moment of singularity. Before that, what was before that? Nothing. And so that's where we dovetail the narrative of Genesis. In the beginning, right, there was nothing. And then God said, let there be light. That sounds like a big explosion, the biggest explosion ever of the universe, which in normal language is called the Big Bang. Scientifically, they call it the moment of singularity. And it was proposed by another priest, Jesuit, Georges Lemaitre, who was Belgian, I believe. And he was also an astrophysicist, all right? And he proposed this Big Bang theory. We'll get to it a little later in more detail. But basically, that's the super macroscopic world, all right? Where the limits of our eyes visualizing stuff. And so we need telescopes to see that world. And so the microscopic and the super macroscopic are works in progress. The more technology we advance, then the deeper and deeper we can see into those 2 ranges, those 2 limits of our normal vision. Normally, on a daily basis, without getting too headache about this, we live in this normal macroscopic world. We just go around seeing stuff that is around us, but we can miss a lot of these 2 other worlds simply because it's the limit of the range of our vision. All right. So then the 3 big origins that we'll be talking about in a little more detail, the origin of the universe, which can be dated to about 13.7 billion years. We'll talk about what a billion means. About 13.7, close to 14 billion years ago is when that Big Bang occurred. It's amazing how astrophysicists now can actually put a number on when it was the origin of the universe, okay? Close to 14 billion years ago, by measuring the rate of expansion and doing the reverse of that, measuring the rate of contraction and how long that would have taken to go back to the singularity. Then the origin of life on Earth. Of course, we need an Earth that is cool enough to be able to sustain life on the crust. And that happened close to 4 billion years ago, maybe 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago. The Earth itself having coalesced as the planetary system developed about 4.5 billion years ago, 4.5 billion years more or less for the origin of the planetary system in our solar system, okay? So life about close to 4 billion years ago, and then humans, well, that's going to be kind of a broad range. The genus Homo, all right, at the level of genus, it's going to be anywhere between 2 million or 200,000 years ago, approximately. All right, so I'm giving you the punchline here, and now from now on, I'm going to try to present the evidence for that. But basically, anywhere from 2 million to 200,000 years ago is the range of where anthropologists estimate that our genus began, the Homo genus. Let's move forward. Okay, so here I give you the dates, more or less. This little exercise, you can do it at home if you want, if you have time, but just to get a feel for million and billion quantities, all right? Because we toss them around, now we toss trillions, like in the debt, or the budget of the nation and so forth. Well, get a feel for these numbers. A million is 10 to the 6, right? You're familiar with scientific notation at this point, where the digit is from 1 to 9, so it's a single digit, and it's easy to do arithmetic on that, subtract and add and so forth on the single digit from 1 to 9, and then times 10 to a power. And the power is a number of zeros or significant digits from the decimal point to the left, right? From the decimal point to the left, so the level of significance. So 1 times 10 to the 6 is a million. How long does it take to count to a million? How long does it take to count to a million? All right. So if we just use a little how to measure, how to quantify in time a verbalization. So if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all right? And then start getting 10, 20, the words keep getting longer because then we get 101, 10,001, 100,099, 1, etc. So the words keep getting larger and larger. It takes more time to say that word. So just an average of a second a word, a second a number, for a gross average of 1 second for every word that we say, every number that we say, counting from 1 to a million, right? If you do the math on it, 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour, it takes between 4 or 5 hours to count continuously from 1 to a million, just nonstop, all right? Second after second after second. So you start getting a feel for the magnitude of 1 million, of whatever. It could be dollars, it could be years. Here we're concerned with the years, right? Because evolutionary time, that is the time frame. The time frame typically is 1 million years, okay? That's the range, that's the comfort range for evolution. But then when we look at the origin of the universe and the origin of Earth and so forth, we have to bump it up one more, 3 orders of magnitude to the billion, which is the next category up. So a billion, I didn't even did the math, but we can do the math because let's take the lower limit of 4 hours to count to a million. And we know that mathematically we're defining in the US, notice in the US we define a billion as 10 to the 9, right? 1 times 10 to the 9. So it is 1,000 million for the US. It's 1,000 million, right? I keep emphasizing the US for a reason. You'll see why in a minute. But so it would be, if a million takes 4 hours, then it's 1,000 times longer. So it would be 4,000 hours, nonstop. You know, how many days is that? How many weeks? I don't know. But it's 24 hours in one day, etc. So you can do the math. How many weeks it would take to count to a billion, you know, just straight 1, 2, 3, 4 until I drop dead, okay? So if a million is a huge number, a billion is a super huge number. In fact, it is such a huge number that we don't even agree on the name of it. Because I mentioned that a billion in the United States is 10 to the 9. But a billion in Europe is 10 to the 12. It's 10 to the 12, okay? Which we would call a trillion. So for the Europeans, 10 to the 9 is actually 1,000 million. All right, so they don't use the word billion until they get to 10 to the 12. In other words, double 10 to the 6. So what for us is a trillion, for the Europeans is a mere billion. And back and forth. What I'm trying to point out is that this number is so huge that we don't even agree. We don't really have a full convention on it, on agreeing on what to call 1,000 million, all right? Let alone a million million. But they use a more systematic way. So they're calling 1 million a million, and a million million, they're calling it a billion, and a million million million, they're calling it a trillion, and so forth. So every time they add, they're taking million as a unit, and every time they add another million magnitude order, another 3 zeros, they're calling that the billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, you know, so it's a little more logic and it's a little more Latinized by adding the prefix of the Latin name for the numbers. Billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion. All right, okay. All right, so it's a huge quantity basically, and like the little proverb, the turtle is slow, but the earth is patient. And the earth is patient pretty much 4.5 billion years. That's how long the earth has been around. So when we leave stuff, organic matter and life undisturbed, and we don't mess around with it, we humans, we leave it alone, that life will likely evolve, okay? Because in this, when you look at the earth in terms of millions of years, you better believe it that the climate is going to change at some point, all right? It will change, it will vary back and forth. And so look at the ice ages, for example, which is measured in hundreds of thousands of years, okay? When the earth has been totally winterized, basically covered with ice. I'm not talking about a layer of ice. I'm talking about 1 to 2 miles of ice, all right? That's an ice age, 1 to 2 miles of ice. When that thing moves and grinds over the years, it just grinds everything in its path. I mean, it created the Great Lakes, for example. The glaciers moving up and out over the hundreds of thousands of years in between what is today US and Canada, that ice carved out the Great Lakes, which are some of the deepest lakes in the world, all right? So it's significant, but over a long period of time. So the turtle is slow, but the earth is patient. And that's what evolution is about. It's the patience of speciation. What else? Okay, also I want to give you this equivalency, thanks to Einstein, and has been confirmed experimentally, that we can, I've been talking about matter, but the same applies to energy in the sense that we now have an equivalency between matter and energy, meaning that there is kind of potential energy to every matter, and there is potential matter to every energy. In other words, here the equivalency is there's mass, M representing mass, right? And the mass of every object, which is made up mostly of its protons and neutrons, which would be the adding up. You see the periodic table of the elements there on the wall, adding up the mass number of each element according to what is made up by the protons and neutrons, which are the massive particles. We say that it's not that the electron doesn't have a mass, we say that the electron mass is negligible. In other words, it's so tiny that it doesn't really fit into the equation. Much more important for the electron is its charge to stabilize the atom, right? The negative charge of the electron. Anyway, so this mass, it can be measured empirically by a scale, by weight, which, by the way, keep in mind that weight, what is weight? The weight, when we weigh ourselves on the scale there in the bathroom, that's not our real weight, that's our mass, okay? Because we have not included the gravitational pull. If we really want to know our weight, we will multiply our mass, 150 or 300 pounds, whatever we weigh, and we have to multiply it times the gravitational pull of the Earth, which according to Newton, also verified, is 9.8 meters per second square. It's an acceleration, it's a pull, all right? So if I drop something, it drops, it's a pull. When I multiply mass times gravity of whatever field I'm in, that gives me the real weight. So our weight would be about 10 times more than our mass, right? Because you figure 9.8 meters per second square, you can approximate it to 10, 9.8, so round it up to 10. So if I weigh 150 pounds on the scale, that's my mass. My weight is 1,500 pounds. That's my real weight. So you don't want to know your weight. You want to know your mass. Okay, but basically this is mass. Okay, every object has mass, material. C is the constant, is the universal constant. And what is C? C is the speed of light. The speed of light, which is the universal constant. All right. Everywhere that scientists have measured, they found C. They find the speed of light to be the same. And it's about 300,000 kilometers per meter, per second. It's not an acceleration, it's a speed. It's a constant velocity. So like you're on the highway and you put the autopilot and you're at 60 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour, okay? It's a constant speed. It's not an acceleration or a deceleration. And that's why it's a constant. The speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second. In other words, if there's a beam of light leaving my finger right now, it's a photon that leaves my finger, okay? In 1 second, in the time that we say 101, this beam of light, this photon, has reached 300,000 kilometers away. All right, so pretty darn fast, but it's not infinite. And that's why it takes 8 minutes for the light of the sun to reach the Earth because of the tremendous distance that is between the two. But it doesn't reach here instantly. So the speed of light is not infinite, it is finite. Okay, and it's a constant, so that's used. But you notice that here is squared. So this one, the speed of light squared, is an acceleration. Okay, this is an acceleration. Anyway, it's a hypothetical formula, has not been able to be verified experimentally, and it cannot really be verified experimentally directly with any instrument, because imagine, first of all, we haven't found anything to go faster than the speed of light, okay? And secondly, this is not just the speed of light, but the speed of light squared, all right? And so we don't really have instruments, to my knowledge, that can actually measure that, okay? Or to, not measure it, but to throw a mass at that acceleration, to accelerate a mass to that acceleration, okay? But that's the equivalency that he gave us after doing all the math. And essentially it means that if I take this phone and was able to throw it at this acceleration, this phone would turn into its equivalent energy, okay? And the reverse is also true. If I take any energy, electricity is an energy, you know, heat is an energy, sound waves are energy, light waves are energy. And if I decelerate it, right, so I can put this mass, I can divide the mass by the speed of light square. If I decelerate it, I would turn that energy into its equivalent mass. Mm-hmm. But you see, it's hypothetical, but the astrophysicists tell us that it's true. Mathematically, it has been verified. This is just to point out that we have now an equivalence that can turn any mass into energy, any mass into energy, at least mathematically, and vice versa. Okay. Let's move now into these 4 fundamental forces here, which so far, all of the forces of the Earth have been crunched down to these 4 fundamental. And Einstein spent the latter part of his life trying to find the unified theory, what is known as the unified theory of forces, you know, to come up with a single unified force for the whole universe, and he was not successful. And other scientists and mostly physicists, these are nuclear physicists or these are quantum physicists that deal in this area, okay? They have not been able to reduce, I'm talking about a formula that will include all four forces, all right? There's, so far, no mathematician, no physicist has been able to come up with, we have formulas for each one of these four. For example, gravity, all right, is, there's a formula for gravity, is mass times acceleration. And electromagnetism also has its formulas. These are together because it turns out whenever there is an electric field, all right, when there is an electric flow, when electrons are flowing, simultaneously they generate a magnetic field around them. And that magnetic field is perpendicular to the flow of the electrons. And that has been verified universally here on Earth. Wherever we test for that, we send a current through a wire, for example, of electricity, just like it's on these sockets now. There's electricity flowing through the wires. And if we measure, there will be a magnetic field that is around that wire, okay? And it's perpendicular. The field is perpendicular to the flow of the electrons. Okay? So that's why these two occur simultaneously. And that's why they're clustered together, electromagnetism. They have their own formulas. And then these are at the macroscopic level and at the super macroscopic level. For example, what is keeping the moon circulating around the Earth? The gravitational force of what object? Of the Earth. It's the Earth's gravity that is pulling on the moon and keeping it, but the moon also has its own acceleration, its own velocity when it was trapped on the Earth's orbit. And so it has its own, and because there is no friction essentially out there, then it continues to that constant speed, but it was trapped into the gravitational field of the Earth and trapped into an orbit, all right? And so it is the pull of gravity, which is a centripetal force, centripetal pulling in, but at the same time, the speed, the velocity of the moon, which is in a linear trajectory, is you can call it centrifugal. It tends to go away from gravity, and so there's a balance between those two forces, and it keeps the moon orbiting. Eventually, the moon will lose it out into outer space, or more tragically, will crash into Earth, because the distance is getting slowly shorter between us and the Earth and the moon. All right, so that's one gravitational, but it turns out that the moon also exerts gravity on the Earth because the moon is a massive body. Any mass exerts gravity. This bottle of water is exerting gravity around it, you know, in a sphere shape, and it's got gravitational pull, very, very tiny because it's according to the mass. But every object, every massive object, every object that has mass exerts gravity, some gravity, okay? So the gravity of the moon on the Earth is very light, but significant enough to cause what? Anybody know? The tides, exactly. So you can think of the ocean, look at the Atlantic Ocean, look at the Pacific Ocean, and the gravity of the moon is pulling on the Earth and is pulling the water, and it makes a bump on the water, you know, and then as the moon travels around the Earth, that bump of water that is trying to go to the moon, literally, all right, but cannot leave because it's trapped into the Earth because of its own gravitational field and the forces between the molecules of water, then that bump just moves with the moon until it crashes on the surface, it crashes on the shoreline, and it creates a tide. High tide, and then when the moon leaves, then the water will recess back into its own place. That's low tide and so forth. They have that. We have one tide in the Atlantic, and because the Pacific is so wide, we actually have two tides in the Pacific on a daily basis, all right? So the moon also exerts gravity in the Earth. In fact, the woman's cycle of ovulation is a 28-day cycle, which is a lunar cycle. Somehow it's associated with the distribution of water on the body of the woman, okay? We men don't cycle that way, but the ovulation cycle is actually somehow tied to the lunar cycle of 28 days. So it does have an effect on all living creatures here on Earth that we have water inside. Then the sun has its own gravitational field that maintains the planets in place, and so on and so forth. We keep making that argument. But these two, gravity and electromagnetism, are fields, and they tend to be in the large scale of the macroscopic, okay? The two forces, these two other forces, all right, which we can call attractions, these are at the super macroscopic level. This is down to the atomic level, all right? And essentially, the strong force is what keeps protons together in the nucleus of the atom, the strong force. Whereas the weak force is the one that is keeping essentially the neutrons as there is decay, nuclear decay of the atom from one neutron to the other. It still maintains the same species, the same element, but it's losing neutrons, all right, or gaining neutrons. But the strong force is the one that I find most fascinating because we know experimentally that protons are positive, right? And normally by electromagnetism, positive charges, do they attract or repel? They repel. Remember when we were kids and we played the little magnets and positive and negative attract each other, but then positive to positive repel each other, negative to negative repel each other, right? When we flip the magnet around. So imagine, think about this in your mind's eye, a nucleus of an atom that is made up of protons and neutrons. Forget about the neutrons for now, they don't have a charge. Protons, what is the charge of the proton? Positive, 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 okay? But they are clustered in the nucleus of the atom. And so why is it that the protons don't fly out from each other? What is holding the nucleus of an atom together? Because by electromagnetism, the protons, which are both positive, let's say 2, 3, 4, I don't care, as many atoms, as many elements as you want to add, protons, all right? From 2 forward, those protons should be repulsing each other, running away. And yet they're tight, they're so tight together that to split that nuclear fission, that's a nuclear bomb. The energy that is holding the protons together, you know, is a nuclear energy. It's a nuclear bomb, all right? And it's a nuclear force. So that is the strong force. That's why it's called strong, because it has tremendous amount of energy that is holding those protons together. And it's a very tiny, tiny distance. The distance is kind of equivalent to the distance to the diameter of the proton. It's the diameter of the proton. If those protons migrate away from each other more than 1 diameter distance, they will explode, they will cause a nuclear reaction. They will cause a nuclear bomb, all right? So as long as they're kept tightly, as tightly together, right next to each other, at a distance that is less than their own diameter, then they're held together. Stable, and that is the stable unit of matter for all the matter that we see around, okay? So without the strong force, everything would just explode into nuclear bombs, all right? So this strong force, very significant, very enigmatic, and very strong, is what holding the atom together, all right? The weak force has to do, like I say, with the neutrons, which are neutral charge, right? But they are massive and they are at the nucleus. And so that's holding them together there and maintaining the atom stable, different isotopes of the same species, the same element. Give me a second here. I need to pick up a text. Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry, not urgent. Okay, so this is a little bit about these four fundamental forces. They're called fundamental because so far no one has been able to find a mathematical formula to describe, to enclose all of them, or two or three of them, okay? So that's where we're at right now, or that's where the quantum physics is right now. And like I say, Einstein spent the rest of his adult life trying to find that the lone quest for the unified force or the unified field or attraction unsuccessfully. All right, he was successful in many other things, but not in this one. So I mentioned the origin of life 3.9 billion years ago. We'll look at it in more detail as we move forward. In further lectures. Now, still, this is just, we're developing a language here, okay? We're developing a lexicon where when I talk about fundamental forces, you know what I'm talking about. Now we need to look a little bit at the organic molecules because it turns out that all life is made up with these organic molecules, okay? So we got basically organic molecules and we got inorganic molecules. And this is how it works. Inorganic molecules tend to be simpler, tend to be smaller in size. Again, we have to use our mind's eye. I know that this lecture is very conceptual, but think about this. What is the chemical formula for water? H2O, right? So how many elements in H2O? The H stands for hydrogen and the O stands for oxygen, all right? So each element, as you can see, I keep pointing at the chart, the periodic chart of the elements there on the wall. Most elements have a single letter, some have two letters. And so these are the elements. It's according to the number of protons in the nucleus. So we start with one proton, which is the minimum number, and that is hydrogen, and then 2 protons is helium, and then 3 protons is lithium, and so forth. And you keep adding protons, you keep adding mass to that atom, okay? Then you can have any number of neutrons. I'm still on the nucleus of the atom. Neutrons will also add mass, but they will not change species as long as you maintain the same number of protons, the same species or the same elements. You're just making it heavier or lighter. So for example, if you add one neutron to the proton, then you to the hydrogen, right, to one proton, then you make that a little heavier. And it's called deuterium. Deuterium is a little heavier hydrogen because it's got a neutron in addition to the proton. But if you add 2 neutrons, okay, then you make it more heavy, super heavy, and it's called tritium, and it's also known as heavy water, and it's radioactive. And the Germans in Nazi Germany in the 1940s were already experimenting with tritium to get to the nuclear bomb, to make a hydrogen bomb, all right? And there's an anecdote of wagons, train wagons that were being transported somewhere up there, maybe Poland or the Czech Republic or Germany or somewhere, but there were trains of water. They just had water in the wagons, okay? And they were stopped at some point, and some people asked, well, what is this? What are you transporting here? And the Germans, the Nazi regime said, oh no, this is just water. Look at it, it's water, right? Yeah, but it was heavy water, it was tritium, it was radioactive water. And they were using it to experiment to get to the hydrogen bomb. Thanks to the Manhattan Project in the United States, which was not done in New York, was done in Los Alamos down in New Mexico. We got the bomb first, and then tragically was dropped 2 of them in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, to tell the world that their nonsense had to stop. You know, the Japanese nonsense and the Nazi nonsense had to stop, and that's what it took. There's much more on that. You can look at it historically. I've heard that before those bombs were actually dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Allied planes flew over those 2 towns with leaflets written in Japanese, get out, go away, leave the city now. And it was papered with those flyers. Some people left, but many didn't. Anyway, that's, there's no clean war, okay? There's no clean war. There were tragic moments, and those 2 fronts Basically, they had to stop. But anyway, it's controversial. I don't want to go there any further. Back to the organic molecules. Organic molecules, so a water molecule, one water molecule has 3 atoms, right? 2 of hydrogen, 1 of oxygen. And the little subscript number tells you the number of atoms, except when there's no subscript, then 1 is implied. Just like in algebra, the coefficient, if I say A or AB, right? That means A times B, and the coefficient of A is 1 and the coefficient of B is 1. So it's 1A times 1B. Then if I put a number, that's different, but the 1 is implied also at the level of exponent. The 1 is implied. When I say A, it's A to the first power, which is just A. All right, so the same here. If there's no number on the formula, on the molecular formula, then 1 atom is implied. So we can say 3 atoms for water, H2O. How about for carbon dioxide? The formula for carbon dioxide is what? CO2. So again, 3 atoms, different atoms. Now we got 2 oxygens and 1 carbon, et cetera, right? Hydrogen, normal. Hydrogen that we breathe in the air is H2. We call it diatomic, 2 atoms. H2, it's stable. Like oxygen, the oxygen that we're breathing right now, what's the formula for the oxygen that we're breathing right now? The gas? O2, right? Diatomic. O2 is stable. 2 atoms of oxygen, they stick together. And then also for nitrogen, which is the biggest component of the air that we're breathing right now, N2, diatomic, is stable gas nitrogen. All right, so these are inorganic molecules, right? Inorganic, but organic molecules have a couple of characteristics. First of all, typically they are hundreds or thousands of atoms. Not necessarily, you can have methane and so forth that are smaller, but typically organic molecules are huge by comparison. Huge meaning the number of atoms, okay? They're large, even though they're still super microscopic because they're molecules, but they're much larger than the inorganic molecules. Also, and more importantly, they need to have 2 elements necessarily. At least they need to have carbon and hydrogen, okay? Carbon and hydrogen to make them organic molecules. It's important, significant for life because life is made up with organic molecules, okay? So they need to have carbon and hydrogen. So for example, CO2, carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of respiration of an organism, of a living organism, is CO2 an organic or an inorganic molecule? I'm gonna say organic. None? Good, okay. Inorganic, right? Because it's got no hydrogen. H2 has hydrogen, but doesn't have carbon, all right? And it has to have, yeah, in a bond, it needs to be bonded. And typically what the hydrogen does, it kind of coats the molecule to stabilize it, all right? It coats the molecule to stabilize it because it provides a proton when needed for the charge to be stable, all right? When there are negative charges sticking out of the molecule, the hydrogen, the protons bind and seal the molecule, stabilize it charge-wise. Neutralizes kind of the coating of the molecule. All right, so carbon and hydrogen together in the bond, what is known as a hydrogen bond, makes for organic molecule. And it turns out that there are 4 types of organic molecules. 4 categories. We got carbohydrates, we got lipids, we got proteins, and we got nucleic acids. All right, so these are the 4 categories. We're very familiar with carbohydrates, sugar, starches, cellulose, et cetera, okay, carbohydrates. It's mostly a chain. It's a skeleton of carbon-to-carbon bonds, which are covalent bonds, very strong, high-energy bonds, carbon to carbon. That's a skeleton, all right? That's the inner core, and then coated with hydrogen with hydrogen bonds, stabilizing the molecule, and those are carbohydrates. And you can see that the words are there: carbon and hydrogen, carbohydrates, right? They have energy, and that's when we burn them, we get energy, we get calories or kilocalories out of them. Lipids are a different type of molecule. They are typically non-soluble in water, and they're the few molecules that are non-soluble in water. Most molecules are soluble in water. All right. We're coming right there. All set. Thank you. Good to see you. Morning. Just picking up a laptop. All right. We'll talk later. Thanks. All right. So lipids are hydrophobic. It's called hydrophobic. In other words, they don't mix with water normally. We have fats, greases, oils, waxes. Those are examples of lipids. They're also essential, fundamental for life on Earth, for organic life. For example, are the cell membranes of our body, all the trillions of cells that we have. The membrane, which I mentioned is a bilayer membrane, is made up of phospholipids. It's mostly lipids, and they have phosphates embedded into them, all right? And so lipids are essential for life, and that's why we also need to eat some level of oil, fat, and grease, and so forth in the food to replenish our lipids in our body. Then the proteins are also very large molecules. Typically, they're polymers, again, like wagons to a train. They're polymers, they're long chains, and they're long chains of what we call amino acids. Amino acids are the basic units of proteins, all right? It's easy to show just a picture. There are 20 amino acids occurring naturally in nature, all right, images. There are 20 amino acids, and you'll see their composition, for example. Here we go. Okay, move this over slowly there. Okay, so these are the 20 amino acids that occur in nature. You can see they're medium-sized molecules. Let me see if this gets a little bigger. No, it actually gets smaller. Maybe if I go the opposite way. Okay, anyway, so these are the 20 amino acids that occur in nature, all right? You can see that the basic structure, the skeleton of the structure, the wiggle in the middle, all right? Those are carbon bonds. Every corner, every one of these little corners is a carbon atom. They're so frequent that they're not illustrated. This is the convention for illustrating organic molecules. Typically, the carbons are just shown by an angle, all right? So whenever you see an angle with no letter, that is a carbon there because they're very frequent. Otherwise, it will be too clustered to put just C, 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 C there at every corner, all right? So when just a little angle corner, that's a carbon. So these are all carbon to carbon bonds, that's what's showing. And then the other elements are shown, all right? Here's a double bond with an oxygen. Here's I guess it's a hydroxyl group, HO. Here's an amine group, and NH2, etc. So depending on how many carbons and how many radicals, the radicals are the things that are sticking out of the skeleton, it will make for 20 possible combinations. And these 20 combinations occur in nature, naturally, all right? As we walk around and we can find them in nature, in the soil, and so forth. What's interesting about this is that these are the basic components of proteins. And when we put dozens or hundreds or thousands of these in chains, we come up with actual functional proteins, okay? And the importance about proteins is that they do the work in, they do the work in the body, in any body. We're talking about animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, the ones that are doing the metabolism, the ones that are doing the body function at the cellular level is the proteins. So cellular metabolism is the proteins are the workers, all right? Thousands of proteins that we have, but the proteins have a code, if you will, what makes up for the sequence of amino acids in a protein. That's the code, and that's the genetic code. And that is embedded in the DNA or RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, all right? And this is deoxyribonucleic acid. And so these are the nucleic acids, either DNA or RNA. And so the DNA is the code that makes up for the proteins, and that's called the genetic code. And we can go here and just punch in. And this is what Watson and Crick deciphered essentially in the 60s. It was the genetic code. Here it is, and it's a square like this. And because the code is a triplet code, in other words, it has 3 bases or 3 nucleotides. So we'll look at DNA a little more closely later on, but basically 3 nucleotides or 3 bases in a sequence makes what is known as a codon, right? Then it can be put on 3 sides of a square. So this is codon, this is the nucleotide 1, this is nucleotide 2, and this is nucleotide 3. Which you notice nucleotide 3 actually includes all 4 bases. That's what is called a wobble. We'll get to that later. But basically, the first one here, and these words in blue inside, okay, these words are the abbreviation of the 20 amino acids. So for example, PHE is phenylalanine, SER is serine, tyrosine, cytosine, histine, protein, leucine, etc., isoleucine, aspergine, etc., alanine, valine, glycine, glutamine, they all end in INE, okay? So there are 20 of these different combinations in here, but you can see that you can get 64 combinations where you multiply 3 times 3 times 3, or actually 4 times 4 times 4 for a triplet, you can get 64. So there is redundancy. In other words, you can get phenylalanine with UUU, or you can get phenylalanine with UUC. Okay, it still gives you the same. So the third triplet, the third nucleotide is what is called a wobble. For phenylalanine, the third nucleotide can be either uracil or guanine cytosine, and you still get the same amino acid. Anyway, too much detail, we'll get into it later, but just to say that we now have a code, a deciphering key, a key to decipher from the DNA sequence what amino acids that sequence codes for, all right? And we have sequencers, we have machines now that we can put DNA inside in a liquid and it will read out the DNA sequence. It's amazing. These sequencers can read out the DNA. That's how we came up with the human genome about 20 to 25 years ago. The year 2000 was a big project of deciphering the human genome, the 3 billion base pairs that make up the human genome, all right? Okay, anyway, so a lot of detail now. We'll get into it later in more slowly, but basically these are the 4 organic molecule groups: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And the combination of these in an orderly fashion inside a cell, what we call metabolism, that's what is life at the organic level, life, okay? And I'm pointing this out because it turns out that we can reproduce this life and we can do experiments to come up with these primitive amino acids. In a very famous experiment, that was done in the Miller-Urey experiment that was done decades ago, to come up with amino acids from inorganic molecules, from the primitive atmosphere, okay? Okay, so because these molecules are very large in comparison to the other ones, to the inorganic, they're called macromolecules. But they're still super macroscopic, okay? They're still molecules, but they're called macromolecules. All right, moving forward, another little convention. Again, this is getting a little too elementary here. But basically, the standard for measuring temperature is how water behaves from the 3 states, going from solid to liquid to gas, or vice versa. It's just by increasing or decreasing temperature. So we use the decimal system for temperature. It's also known as centigrade or Celsius, because it was this Greek guy Celsius that invented it when he was taking ice and melting it, and then liquid water and boiling it, determined that those two transitions will be the lower and the upper boundary of the centigrade scale. Again, the word centigrade meaning 100 degrees, all right? So from 0 to 100 degrees is the centigrade scale, and it is the transition of states for water, so that at 0 degree, water freezes. From 0 to 100 degree, water is liquid under normal pressure, because if we change the pressure, that's going to alter. And at 100 degree, water boils, turns from liquid into gas. All right, so that's the convention, and that is the decimal centigrade. That's why it's 100, it's a decimal system. Then we also have the British system, all right, which is not decimal because it's not based on what water does. It's based on something else, which I can't remember what it is right now. But basically, the equivalent is 32 degree Fahrenheit is where water freezes in the Fahrenheit scale, which is British, all right? Attributed to, I guess, Lord Fahrenheit or something. So 32 degrees Fahrenheit is equivalent to 0 degrees centigrade, and that's why temperature in the 30s is cold, temperature in the 40s in Fahrenheit is cold, because we're down to single digits there in the centigrade scale, all right? And boiling, I forgot the little degree sign there, boiling is 212 for Fahrenheit. Okay, so 100 degrees centigrade is equivalent to 212 Fahrenheit. Again, you can see what's the logic to this. It's definitely not following what the water is doing. Okay, because these two numbers, 32 and 212 for water. So it's based on another thing, which I can't remember right now what it's based on, the Fahrenheit scale. But it's definitely not the change of state of water, which is easy to observe because we're either observing a piece of ice or we're observing liquid water or we got gas, right? All right, so this also with regards to the primitive atmosphere, this were the main components of the primitive atmosphere, not like today. And like I mentioned, the atmosphere has changed maybe 2 or 3 times throughout its lifetime. But back at the beginning of the Earth, when the Earth was coalescing, was known as accretion, when the Earth gathered enough mass to become a planet as a whole, all right? It's called accretion by the pulling in of more bodies that were floating around, pieces of rock, huge sections of fragments of other, mass, of rock, and it was coalescing together, all right? At first, it was very, very hot. It was mostly in a molten state. And so there was no possible life that could emerge there. It was way too hot because it would boil everything. Keep in mind that organic life, the basis of organic life is liquid water. The basis of organic life, and the only one we know so far is here on Earth, is liquid water because it's basically a soup. It's a reaction. It's a biochemical reaction that we call metabolism at the cellular level. And so we need liquid water. In fact, our cells are mostly liquid water. They're 90, 95% water, or 85% water, okay? So the primitive atmosphere had gas, but it was, had water, but it was in gas, water vapor. No life in water vapor, all right? It had also a significant amount of ammonia and methane, and then hydrogen, which is very explosive, and it's a good thing that a lot of the hydrogen has dissipated, because otherwise hydrogen is very, very explosive and it catches on fire very easily. All right, so that's the composition of the primitive atmosphere, which is very different from our Earth atmosphere today, which is mostly hydrogen, mostly nitrogen, about 3/4 nitrogen, about 16% more or less oxygen. And then CO2 is very, very tiny, it's less than 1%. And hydrogen is less than a thousandth of a percentage, which is a good thing. Okay, so just from here to know that the primitive atmosphere was very different from what we have today. When we look at the origin of life itself, we'll look at it in more detail. Yes, the biological definition of species, which we talked about, has 2 components. Did I talk about the biological definition of species? Yeah, right, from Meyer. Basically, that's what he gave us last century, one big contribution, that it has 2 characteristics, right? What is the biological definition of species? One, that it is organisms that can reproduce. Chat, yeah, got it. Okay, right. Offspring that can generate offspring, all right? Two individuals that can generate, or even a single individual by asexual reproduction, but some individual, some organism that can generate a new one of its own species, okay? And second is that the new generation, the offspring, has to be fertile. Okay, so those are the two characteristics for having the biological definition for qualifying as a species. Okay, we're talking about scientific classification already, the binomial. So when I talk about binomial scientific classification, you know what I'm talking about. So let's look at the origin. Again, this is the big picture because we're going to drill down into these, each one of these slides for a whole lecture, okay? Origin of humans, this is kind of the chronology, the time scale. MYA means millions of years ago, okay? MYA, millions of years ago. So for the tribe, hominin tribe, which is already, the tribe is like a subcategory of the family. Each one of those categories has sub and supra categories, okay? Let me go back here. Each one of these categories has sub and supra categories. For example, when we get to the class, you know, you hear vertebrates, right? Because we have a spinal cord that is segmented into vertebrae. And we share the vertebrates with other mammals. We share vertebrates with birds, with reptiles, with fish, okay? With amphibians, they all have a spinal cord that is segmented. But actually, vertebrate is not our class. Vertebrate is a subclass. The class is chordata, chordates. In other words, to have a spinal cord, that's the class. And subclass is vertebrate, that the spinal cord is segmented, is articulated so that it can move, okay? Because there are other primitive organisms that have a spinal cord, but it's not segmented, it's rigid. And there are very few left around anymore in the world, primitive, almost extinct. But so we are the subclass of vertebrates. Just to give an example, that each one of these categories has supra and sub, except of course for the domain, there's no supra domain because that's the whole earth, all the living organisms. Okay, so a tribe is a subfamily. All right, you got clan and tribe that go in here, and they have slightly different meaning biologically or anthropologically, right? Because anthropologists also talk about tribes and clans. They have a slightly different nuance, but basically that's at the level here. It's between family and genus, is the tribe. So for the hominin tribe, notice the wording, hominin tribe, that occurred, that diverged, you know, from other mammals, from other primates, about 8 million years ago, more or less. The divergence between chimp and human, I think I've mentioned that chimp and human were the closest relatives, biologically speaking. We have 99% homology. Homology meaning that our DNA, the DNA sequence, the 3 billion base pairs between the chimp and the human, it's 99% identical. It's just 1%, yeah, but if you figure out 1% of 3 billion is quite a bit, all right? It's quite a bit, 100,000 of millions actually of DNA sequence. And that 1% makes a big difference. Like the French say, la petite différence, okay? La petite différence is that 1% of DNA difference is the difference between us and a chimp. You would see a skeleton of a chimp when you go out there in the hallway. That's a skeleton of a chimp. And the first thing you notice is that they walk on 4 legs. It's called knuckle walking. We're the only ones that have developed bipedal, meaning 2 legs. And it frees our hands. Freeing our hands was a tremendous evolutionary advantage. But that already happened at the level of the genus, okay? Not at the species. So there are other homos that are not sapiens that already were walking bipedal. For example, Neanderthal and Homo erectus and so forth. So we have evidence from the fossil record that there were other Homo genera walking around that were not sapiens and were already bipedal. Right? One that's very famous is that Lucy. It's actually an Australopithecus that was bipedal. I think she goes back about 6 million years. She's in the borderline between here between 6 million and 3 million. And what they found there was prints, which actually first there were prints of one walking around, and it's a female, so they just named her Lucy. And then there's other one with a little clan. There's actually, or maybe a family, they're walking around larger prints, and then some smaller prints of the kid walking next to the adult, all right? So those were found in mud that was layered, and it was bipedal. There was no knuckles in front of the footprint, the literal footprint. There was no handprint on it. And it goes on for a long stretch. Okay, so then modern human, like I mentioned, modern human is about 200,000 years ago, the most recent, right? What we call Homo sapiens sapiens, the subspecies of Homo sapiens, which is the only one that we have left today, us. 100,000, 200,000 is the closer range. Look, so what I'm saying here is that there were other Homo species between 3 million years ago and 1 million year that are now extinct, but we have the fossil record, and that's what we'll be looking at in further classes. And these are, at least these 3 other homos have been found in the fossil record. Homo habilis, so again, the binomial nomenclature, when it's the same genus, then it's just the capital letter of the first word. Of the capital letter for homo is H, and then period, space, and then the species individual name listed fully, all right? And then the convention is that you either put the word in italic, put the binomial word in italic, or you underline it, one or the other, not both. All right, so that's a convention. You read the scientific journals and you see the species name is either italicized, leaning over, or it is underlined. So we got habilis, we got ergaster, Homo erectus, georgicus, found in Georgia, not Georgia, Florida, not Georgia, US, but Georgia, Eastern Europe. Heidelbergensis was from the region of Heidelberg in Germany. Neanderthalis is the closest to us. We coexisted, habilis, sapiens and Neanderthalis coexisted in Europe up until about 40,000 years ago. And again, from all the material culture, sorry, I thought I wanted to sneeze. So from the evidence that we find on the cultural material stuff, lost my train of thought. Neanderthalis coexisted with humans for up until about 40,000 years ago, which is very, very recent in evolutionary time. And essentially we wiped them out. But they had a larger brain capacity, they had a larger cranium, and we wiped them out. So that means that the brain is not maximized in efficiency, but it's optimized. There's some optimal range, and beyond that optimal range, then it's about the actual skills. Maybe smaller bodies. It is estimated, it is conjectured that the Neanderthalis were actually a little larger than us, and we outpaced them, outrun them. We were more agile, and we were able to, because it became a place of competitive exclusion, especially in Europe. We were basically, with Neanderthals, we were competing for the same, we're hunting the same game, the same animals, all right, the large mammals. And so that competitive exclusion principle, which is that two species that are going after the same prey over some time, the better species will displace the other species, okay? And we managed to do that in Europe to the point that we essentially wiped out the Neanderthals. So there are about anywhere from half a dozen to a full dozen species of Homo that existed before us, and the fossil record is there, and this is what makes the evolutionary branching of our ancestors in the genus Homo, all right? We'll get into the evidence in more detail as we go forward. Finally, let's see what we have here, a couple more slides. Characteristics for the Homo, again at the genus level. At the genus level, all of these characteristics apply already from what we know from anthropology and research of the fossil record, but also what is known as the material culture. What's the material culture? What they left behind, the remains, okay? So anything from the campfire that they built to the bones that were found inside the campfire, incinerated, that tells us what they ate. Also what they pooped. There's a science called scitology, which studies the defecation of animals to see what they ate, right? The organic remains, what went through the system, and that tells us what they ate, which tells us what they hunted, what they cultivated, etc. And so that's all part of the material culture that's left behind. The pots, the charts of pots that were broken and left behind, you know, the stone tools that they used and so forth. I talk about primitive Homo. For our standards, they left a lot of stuff behind, okay? And so that is all studied by anthropologists to figure out, to put together a scenario, a picture of how they lived, what was their daily living, all right? Including where they lived, the caves and so forth, or the open fields, what they left behind. So we find that they're fully bipedal already at the level of the genus, meaning that they don't have to go down on their knuckles periodically like the chimps do. They can stay upright, and that's because of a shift in the pelvis of the bones, and the arching is an S shape. What happens to the column is the spinal column becomes an S shape, whereas the column, you'll see it when you go out, look at the skeleton of the chimp there, the column of the chimp is not S shape, it is a curve, all right? So that curve cannot sustain walking on two legs for a long period of time. We see that chimps can walk for a period of time on two legs, right? They wobble back and forth, right? But eventually they get tired, their backs ache, and they have to come down on the forelimbs, on the forward limbs, to relieve the pressure on the back because they don't have an S. They don't have that little S on the back that we have. That what makes us able to walk bipedally, essentially indefinitely, you know, without having to go down on our hands anymore. That frees up the hands for tool making, all right, big time. And so there's a synergy that occurs between the brain and the hand for making tools that makes the brain expand also, okay? And so we have a brain size that is about twice as much. We, Homo, talk about all of the Homos, including Homo erectus, the first one, they have twice as much the brain size. We know that by the cranium that is left as the closest ancestor or a contemporary of Homo in the Australopithecus. The Australopithecus are the southern apes that did not develop into Homo. They stayed as apes. They stayed as monkeys. All right, so, or primates. So we have twice the brain size capacity. Also, we harness fire. Every other animal on this planet runs away from fire, okay? We go toward fire. Aside from the curiosity that we have about fire, we actually harness it. And we harness it for several things: to keep us warm, to use it as a defense, right? With a torch, because we realize that other animals are afraid of fire. We also use it for cooking because something accidentally fell into the fire and it started smelling good, so we picked it up and ate it. I mean, our ancestors. And so we realized that cooking, fire can be used for cooking, which starts the digestive process. So we get more out of food, get more nutrition out of food when we cook it, because we're actually, what we're doing organically is we're beginning the digestive process. We're breaking down the organic molecules. We're breaking down the macromolecules, mostly the proteins, the lipids, and the carbohydrates, all right? So that we get more nutrition out of it. I think there was a chat coming in. Give me a minute. It's in here somewhere. Was there a chat? No, okay. So we harness fire, the Homo, our ancestors, Homo, hominins, harness fire. We also started with clothing. And clothing, you know, you don't see any other animal wearing clothing to this day, right? But we do. We take it for granted. No one in their normal mind will go out on the street naked, you know, unless they're not well in the head. And yet animals, no animal would ever think of getting clothing, not extra clothing. So that's also a Homo characteristic from our ancestors. Also lithic technology. Lithic technology is simply tool making. It's just a fancy word for tool because lithos is a reference to rock or stone, right? And so lithic technology is tool making. Now we know that some animals also, like the chimpanzee and some birds, a crow will use a twig with its beak to get out the little larvae from a hole and so forth. But that's using a tool. But beyond using a tool is making a tool, all right? So use a tool to make a tool. That's a second level. It's a quantum leap mentally. So even though we see a few animals using some very primitive level of tool out there, all right? They don't make tools, all right? So for example, taking a stone and chipping away another stone and using the edge of that second stone for cutting, I have actually made a knife, okay? So making a tool is a unique characteristic of the Homo. Symbolic culture also, including the development of religion, mixed in with magic and superstition. So when a lightning struck, that was considered some kind of a supernatural event, right? And it was giving a supernatural meaning. That capacity, which occurs on the cerebral cortex of the brain, where we have abstract thoughts, all right, is sophisticating, and we don't seem to find it in any other animal. Again, observing at the chimpanzee, we don't really see the chimpanzee going into reflection or meditation or let alone any practice of religion. We don't see the chimpanzee doing art either, which is associated with religion, okay? Because it's trying to express, it's trying to capture graphically something that is metaphysical, something that is beyond this earth, all right? Art has a value, has an inspiring the aesthetic value, but when I show a painting where let's say that we agree on a painting that is beautiful, we show that to a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee has no clue. The first thing that chimpanzee wants to know about the painting is if he can eat it, all right? And so there's no art in other animals, and so that is associated with an abstract thought that is also somehow associated with the practice of religion, but the real clincher is burying the dead, because we see no other animal burying the dead either. Yes, I know about the stories, the anecdotes about the elephant staying next to the dead baby elephant that died, and the dolphins pushing up the dead baby dolphin to the surface for breathing until they get exhausted, but there's no actual real burial. And burial will stuff, so that even the most primitive Homo, all right, we're talking about Homo erectus, for example, you know, 2-3 million years ago, they will bury their dead not naked. They will bury their dead clothed. And in top of that, they put more stuff in the tomb that we put in the tomb today. They put food in the tomb. They put the objects, the material belongings, the jewelry. Sometimes they buried their slaves into the tomb also. They killed the slaves of the guy who died, and they buried them also in there. So burying the dead with such ritual, with such stuff that was put into the grave, tells us what these primitive people were believing. You know, that there was some kind of an afterlife, some kind of a journey. Why put food into a grave unless you thought that that human was somehow waking up into another world and needed to be fed into the other world, you see? So these are very primitive telltales of the fact that they had an abstract thought that was way more sophisticated than any other living creature all the time. And so when we put all these characteristics together, this gets us to the level of the genus Homo, again, starting about 3 million years ago forward, okay? And we still the question of how did that arise and how did we get from like a Neanderthal or even more primitive than a Neanderthal, a Homo erectus, which looks very, very chimp-like or very ape-like to us, okay? How do we transition that? Well, that's the phylogenetics of the origin of our species. Let me see. I realize I have not stopped for break. I'm doing that on purpose. I only have one more slide to cover because I need to actually quit around 11:45 because there's a presentation coming up at 12 noon of undergraduate scientists that are doing something with a life science South Florida. So I need to stop early, okay? But this last slide, excuse me, is just introducing Meyer chapter 1. So let me stop for a moment. I've been talking for too long, and maybe you have some questions or comments to make along the way, including, let me open the chat here just in case. Where's the chat? Here. Okay, so Jorge or Chris, excuse me. Jorge or Chris, if you have any questions or comments to make of what I've been talking about for the past 2 hours nonstop. Okay, I think it is recording because the little dot here is circular and blinking. So hopefully all this recording in case you want to go over it. I understand that some of it has been more rudimentary for you, especially if you have a scientific background. I'm just trying to bring everyone on board on the same page, okay? So let me delve a little bit on this last slide. And in doing that, I'm going to raise the actual, whatchamacallit, that I sent you by mail and that you have here in class physically, the second sheet. Actually, the last page of the handout, of the outline is Meyer, like I mentioned, is just an introduction. It's a summary of his first chapter, finding here, opening this, and downloading, going to the last page. Okay. So what Meyer does there, and that's why I like his book, even though it's, we can say on the scientific side, it's outdated. Also, it's out of print, okay? But every time I find some soft covers online, I buy them and I store them and I stock them, get them for under $10 or so. And so that's why I loan it to you for the duration of the course. And then if you want to keep it as a reference, then just go online, buy your own and give me mine back, okay? But you can also download it for free, virtual. I just find having the physical book, which I don't have in front of me right now, is helpful. Anyway, this is, like I say, a summary of the first chapter. I like Meyer because he goes into the philosophical questions. You know, back then, the scientists still had enough guts to delve into the philosophical and even the theological questions, all right? Today, empirical scientists, they're just empiricists. They're absolute horizontal. And the minute you mention the word religion, you have not finished saying the word religion or theology or philosophy. And they say, excuse me, well, that's your opinion, but I have my opinion, and that's the end of the discussion. You know, it's very hard to engage empirical scientists today in philosophical or even less theological arguments, because generally the feeling is, I've been around enough empirical scientists to know that the general feeling is, well, that's an opinion, right? They don't realize that both philosophy and theology are sciences because they have a methodology, but they don't have a deductive methodology like empirical sciences that is based on matter and energy, right? Rather, we deal with thought. We deal with thought, and we also open to the possibility of illumination, meaning belief, and then we get the full picture. Because there are many things that cannot be explained by just empiricism, okay? For example, altruism, why surrender one's life for someone else? You know, heroism doesn't really have an empirical explanation. And that's just one thing. That's just one example. There are many others that we'll get to. All right, anyway, so he asked the basic fundamental questions like who are we, you know, where are we going, where did we come from? And he dares to ask these questions. The sad thing is that he concludes, he's kind of reductionist, he's very simplistic in the answers because he didn't really have a very systematic historical, he didn't have a systematic education in philosophy and much less in theology. He was an excellent empirical scientist, all right? And very analytical and very observant to the point of being part of the modern synthesis and giving us that biological definition of life and so forth. But at least he had the courage to consider the philosophical and the theological questions of life. Like, who are we? What the heck are we doing in this planet? You know, and so forth. So, but then what happened was he was also a product of his own time. And therefore, he cannot get away from a fundamentalistic interpretation of the Bible of his own time, you know, which also Darwin was subject to that, and even Mendel and everybody else, because before the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, when criticism started, there's a method of studying the Bible that is called critical analysis or critical analysis, which is to try to put aside the issue of revelation, right? That it's divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit, and just look at the text itself. So analyze the text in its own value, see if it makes sense, put it in the historical context of the time. For example, if we talk about the Gospels, which tells about the life of Jesus, we go back 2,000 years ago to Palestine, what was Palestine then, you know, what is today known as Israel, also known as the Holy Land, and to see what we know from the material culture that is left from that time, how these Hebrew people lived and worked and interacted with each other. We know that it was a theocracy. We know that it was a state that was run by the religious beliefs of the Jewish people. We know that they had a caste system of the high priest, and they had a temple, they had rabbis, and they had followers, they had commandments. You know, that's part of their culture. We also know that there was a superimposed culture of the Roman Empire that had gone all around the Mediterranean, including the Middle East and Northern Africa, certainly Europe and so forth. And so there was another layer of another very different culture, which was the Roman Empire, the Roman culture. And that one goes back also centuries. In fact, the Jewish people go back millennia, but they had less material culture than the Romans. And the Romans themselves was a complicated culture because they had absorbed a lot of Greek culture that went back about 300 or 400 years before the time of Christ. So all these layers of complexity happened back then. And so we put the text to the test. We read the Bible, we read, for example, the Gospels, you know, of which there are only 4 of the 73 books. And we see how does this fit in the context of what we know materially, culturally, of the time of Palestine 2,000 years ago, okay? And we see that a lot of pieces do fit, but we have to stick with the big picture. So that critical analysis was begun by the Protestants in Germany, well, now about almost 200 years ago, at the end of the 1800s, and it moved through, but it was not in the popular culture. The popular culture essentially interpreted the Bible literally, okay? With a lot of pain, because there's some passages of the Bible that if you interpret literally, you have to actually mutilate your body. And so it's a big problem. Anyway, they interpreted, so when it says that God created humans, they meant that God really planted us here. He threw us in here from a spaceship, a hypothetical spaceship, and all of a sudden here we are, dressed in our modern attire as we landed here on Earth, placed here by God. Well, that's a simplistic view interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. And today, at least as Catholics, we take exception to that interpretation. We say that that is a fundamentalistic, literal interpretation of the Bible that we do not believe in. That's precisely the Bible that we don't believe in as Catholics, okay? And a number of Protestants are also with us, but the fundamentalists, that's where they're at, okay? And so what happened was that these people, these scientists, and also Darwin was subject to that interpretation, that literal interpretation of the Bible. And so, yes, if we look at a literal, fundamentalistic interpretation of the Bible, it's incompatible with the scientific evidence of the bones of our ancestors, which are there in the fossil record, okay? And so it is inconsistent if we interpret the Bible literally. That's the point. And many people did, and even the hierarchy of the church, the Catholic Church did, okay? And so there were things like suppression. For example, Robert Bellarmine, who was Saint Robert Bellarmine, we just celebrated his Saints' Day a few days ago. He's the one who put Galileo Galilei on trial. Essentially, he was the canon lawyer who did the trial on behalf of the church against Galileo for proposing that the earth is not the center of the universe, that it is the sun, the center. Well, he was wrong also, because Galileo is not, the sun is not the center of the universe, it's the center of the planetary system, right, of our solar system. But at least within our solar system, it is the geographic center, all right? And that's called heliocentric. Whereas the church maintained that the earth was the center of the universe, of the whole universe. That's called geocentric, but that was a theological reason. Why is the center? To this day, the earth is the center of the earth, the universe. I can say that the earth is the center of the universe. I can say it theologically, not empirically, because empirically I'm way off. But theologically, why? Because the incarnation occurred here on earth, okay? And if the incarnation is God becoming a human, then where that human occurred has to be the center of the universe. But it's a theological center. It's not a physiological center. It's not a geographical center, okay? It's not an astronomical center. So the church was right, because the church was wrong, but Galileo was also right. They were just talking in different levels, different type of language. One was real, actual physical language, right? Describing the phenomena, the physical phenomena. And the other one was allegoric language or theological language or symbolic language. So the earth is the symbolic center of the universe because according to Christian belief, this is where God became incarnate, right? The divine took on a human nature. Okay, so that incompatibility, that inconsistency, incongruency, unfortunately affected the thinking of Ernst Mayr, and so he ends up rejecting that vision, which is a creationistic vision, the creationism version of the Bible. And that's why I have a little asterisk there to explain that that is not our thinking today, but that was his misconception, Mayr's misconception of Genesis 1 and 2, which was according to the thinking of the time, You follow? All right. So he comes up with these three categories. It's either an infinite world, like Greek philosophy of cycling, and we see that in Greek philosophy indeed, or is a constant world of short, they talk about 6,000 years, right? The creationists talk about the origin of the world in 6,000 years, which obviously doesn't match the geologic record of 4.5 billion years, all right? So that's the creationist interpretation. Or the evolving organic world of the physical empirical evidence that he's seeing all around him in increasing amounts. And so he ends up rejecting the first two and sticking with the third one, which is the only one that can be measured empirically. And that's why he ends up being just a straight up empiricist. But unfortunately, I say with all due respect, since he's dead now, he was weak in his philosophy and even weaker in his theology. It was just he allowed himself to be too affected by the culture of the time, which was a misculture, was the bad, wrong, erroneous, simplistic, pre-scientific, if you will, interpretation of the Bible, especially of Genesis. We're talking about Genesis 1 and 2 here, 1 and 2, maybe chapter 3, if you want to throw in original sin, all right? So then very fast, the Copernican revolution comes around, so a number of mathematicians and observants, just naturalists, so in Europe mostly, are looking at the nature around them and coming to some conclusions. They're also looking at the constellations and making some calculations. And the Copernican revolution, about 500 years ago, more or less, is considered to be the beginning of modern science. So when we talk about modern science, it's very recent in our human history, only about 500 years, begins with Nicolas Copernicus, who was also declared as a heretic, and because he rejected the teaching of the church at that time, which was a fundamentalistic teaching interpretation of the Bible, all right? Then we get into the 17th and 18th century, mostly in continental Europe and also the British Isles. With Lamarck, he was French, he was Catholic, but he comes up with this inheritance of acquired characteristics, which is, we know is not true today. In other words, if I have my body and I start doing weights, I will increase my muscle mass, right? So I have acquired, let's say, characteristics, but as bulky as I may get with my muscle mass, as a bodybuilder, when I have children, my children will not automatically be, will have a body-built body when they grow, okay? So that characteristic that I developed during my lifetime will not be passed on because it would have to be in the genes. Of course, they didn't know about genes, they didn't know about DNA back then. Only Mendel is talking about these inheritance characteristics, and that's why these inheritance characteristics are so powerful. Okay, because they give the mechanism of what is going to be passed down, but not what I develop in my lifetime, all right? And so Lamarck was talking about the giraffe, the classical example of how did the giraffe get its tall neck? Well, because the giraffes are trying to reach in the grassland, when they run out of grass, they're trying to reach the acacia leaves on the branches of the leaves, and those leaves are high, so they have to stretch up to reach the leaves, right? And so that neck got longer and longer. Yeah, we can say that perhaps for an individual giraffe, as he or she was growing, stretching the neck made her reach the taller leaves, okay, a little bit. But even if that giraffe in his or her lifetime developed a longer neck just by reaching out, just like the bodybuilder by pumping iron, that is not going to be passed on to the next giraffe, to the next generation giraffe. It's not passed on, okay, because it's an acquired characteristic. So we can say today that no, there is no inheritance of acquired characteristics. But characteristics that are already in my genome, characteristics that are in my genes, they can be passed on. And they will be passed on in the sex cells, okay, in the gametes. So, but what was significant about Lamarck is that he started very much the discussion about passing on the inheritance of characteristics. He started the thinking, or he published on this, okay? And there was something called the Scala Natura, which you can read in Myers, which was every animal and every plant was placed on a ladder according to their complexity, to how simple or complex they look. And of course, at the top of the ladder is always going to be the human, right? And then at the very bottom are going to be things like worms and small primitive animals and so forth. That was also done with plants and so forth. So that there was a scale, there was a ladder of increasing complexity in nature, but it was fixed, it was static. There was no, until Darwin really on his theory, and Wallace also, there was no real thinking of, no one there to think, how can one rung of the ladder, how can one step of the ladder turn into another step? There was no transition from the different steps of the ladder. It was static, all right? Every animal, every plant was placed in the ladder, and that's where they stayed. There was no flow from one rung to another, which the theory of evolution is saying that essentially the ladder is not a ladder, it's more like a conveyor belt. There's a movement, there's a constant movement, but very slow from one species into the next. So there's this speciation going on in the background of nature, and that's how we come up with biodiversity. All right, so you can read more about it because I'm getting very close to the time here where I need to quit. Read chapter 1 of Meyer You can use this as a guideline for your summary there. Don't give me a separate summary for Meyer integrated into the one summary, okay? So that's gonna be your task, your creative task is going to be to integrate whatever you read from Meyer chapter 1 into the summary of this lecture, all right? So you use what I've been talking about, including the outline that I gave you here, and try to integrate where you see it fits some of Meyer's thoughts on chapter 1 there, but read it mostly for your own sake and see if, so always think critically. So think critically of what I'm telling you. Is the professor right? How is, am I right in my interpretation of Meyer, especially these first chapters, but chapter 1 in particular, okay? Am I right thinking that Meyer is weak in his philosophy and his theology and that he's essentially acquiescing to a literal fundamentalistic interpretation of the Bible, or did I get it all wrong? All right, so when you read that chapter, read it critically, thinking of what I've been telling you. Okay, folks, anything else? All right, thanks a lot. You've been very, very patient with me to tolerate this terrain nonstop. Basically, it's in the video here. So I'm gonna stop now. Again, if you have any further questions, oh, a little chat here. Let me check it out. Okay, thank you again. Thanks for participating. And we'll be in touch. Okay, so in principle, we have class next Saturday also. And I'll try to see moving forward, depending on how fast we move, if we can carve out one more Saturday to go out there into the forest. Hopefully there won't be another storm coming by. Okay, thanks again, folks. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll be in touch, all right? I'm gonna stop recording.